Welcome to Notable Approvals. Okay, I'm Attorney Amanda Shaffer, just getting it all set up on all the channels here. I think we got it. So welcome to Notable Approvals. I'm Attorney Amanda Shaffer. It's been a little while since I've talked about a long case like I'm going to today. I'm very excited about today's case. Quickly, before I get to the case, quick reminder, don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you are watching. So today's case is a notable approval due to the rareness of the case. What I mean by that is we do a lot of VAWA cases, which stands for Violence Against Women's Act. It's for abused spouses, children, parents, U.S. citizens, and LPRs. It enables you to get a green card if you are a victim of abuse. But it's very rare that someone is able to have VAWA approved and be in a position to come back to the U.S. as a permanent resident, approved when they're outside the country, and then come back, re-enter. And part of that reason has to do with inadmissibilities. So I will get to that whole explanation in a second. I forgot to also remind you, if you find this video to be helpful or know someone who may, please hit that share button, that save button, so we can get this out to more people. Okay, so client for this case, he's a native and citizen of the country, not the state, of Georgia. And he filed for his VAWA in August of 2021. He called me for the first time that summer when he was had already left the country. And the first thing we did was, because he said, I just left, I didn't really take anything with me, was we filed a FOIA request, which stands for Freedom of Information Act. And it basically gets you your whole immigration file. So his wife had previously filed for him when he was here, and he didn't even have his marriage certificate. He didn't have any of the marriage evidence. So we were able to get some good evidence from the FOIA file that had, even though USCIS had it, it's a different office that deals with the VAWA. Even in a new filing, even if you refile with the same spouse, you never assume that USCIS has it and will look at it. So you always have to refile everything. Let's quickly go over the requirements for VAWA. I mentioned in brief a few minutes ago. So in this case, I'm only going to talk, I know I mentioned parents and children, but we're only going to talk about spouses today. So you have to be a spouse of a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, or former spouse. If you are a former spouse, you have to file within 2 years of your marriage ending. You have to currently reside in the U.S. with your spouse, with that spouse, your abusive spouse, or have previously resided in the U.S. with your abusive spouse. The abuse must have taken place when you were in the U.S. You have to have been subject to abuse by your spouse. Your marriage has to have been entered into in good faith, and you have to have good moral character. Now, I said earlier that it's rare for someone to get a VAWA approved outside of the U.S. You have to show, well, the VAWA case itself, if you go back in my archive of videos, you will find there's one video I talk about VAWA where the client had a false claim to citizenship. Her VAWA was also approved, but she's never eligible for a green card. So it can be approved when you're abroad, but the issue is coming back into the country. Because if you overstay your visa by up to a year, then you leave, you're subject to a 3-year bar of inadmissibility to return. If you stay more than a year, now you're subject to a 10-year bar of inadmissibility. There are waivers to the bar that you can file, an extreme hardship waiver. But for VAWA, there's one exception that's really important, and that's what comes into place in this case. And that is, if you leave the U.S. because of the abuse and you're filing for VAWA, and you can show the connection, then you don't have to apply for a waiver, and you should have no problem coming back here. Now, I will provide an update on this case once my client does successfully get his immigrant visa, but I'm talking about it now because I have no doubt he will. Plus, his VAWA case is an interesting one to begin with, especially because there's a lot of people out there still that are unaware, due to the name of the statute, Violence Against Women's Act, that it also applies to men just the same. So, this client, he actually, before he came to the US, he had lived with a domestic partner for 11 years. They had 2 kids together, but no marriage certificate, nothing formal or anything like that. The two of them and their kids applied. They all applied for a visa to the US to visit together. And, they had been, and this was in 2016. They had been having problems in their marriage already, but about a week after coming to the US to visit, his partner tells him, I'm not going back with you to Georgia. I'm staying here and I'm keeping the kids. And, this was absolutely devastating to him. And she didn't even tell him in person. It was on the phone. He finds out later on she actually lied. She actually went back to Georgia with the kids and didn't tell him. So at this time, he was still within his authorized period of stay. And he was kind of, pretty down, of course. But he realized that due to all the problems in his marriage, he needed to move on. So shortly after, he was sitting in a restaurant and they got into a conversation with some girls or some women. Eventually, they exchanged numbers and he started to date her pretty regularly after that. Now, I'm going to point out red flags as I go along. If you're not sure what a red flag is something to look out for in your own relationship that may indicate that you can become an abuse victim if you decide to continue in the relationship that you are in. Doesn't mean these are red flags in every situation, but they're just things to keep in mind. We see this a lot, and usually there's not one red flag, there is multiple. First red flag. And when he talked about what they used to do together, what dates they used to go. Well, he said she only liked to go to restaurants. She didn't like to go to movies or parks or anything else because she just liked to drink. Anyone who only likes to drink as a hobby, red flag. Okay. But regardless, he fell for her pretty quickly, partly because he felt abandoned. And she was being really supportive. He was new to the country. She was helping him get comfortable. And at that point, he still planned to leave the US, but she kind of begged him to stay. She said, "Look, I'll support you. I'll take care of you. We'll get you, we want to see where this relationship's going to go." And he was falling for her and he wanted to see where it was going as well. So he said, "Okay, I'll stay for you." And then in March of 2017, she asked him to move in with her. And here comes our second red flag. I need to have like a red flag flash. I don't know what that is. Second red flag was she had a roommate in a 1-bedroom apartment and she refused to kick the roommate out. So she invites him to move in. Now there's 3 people in a 1-bedroom, which is quite tight in New York City. And he was living in New York City at the time in Manhattan. And obviously, this ended up causing a lot of fights and issues with their relationship. He also had reasons to believe that this woman was more than just friends with his, at that time, girlfriend. But otherwise, everything was going pretty well. He said he was falling more in love with her every day. She was talking about bringing his kids here. Then we get red flag number 3. He was starting to become more dependent on her. And this was at her kind of pushing, more dependent on her in general. And I'm going to get to the dependence as we go. So about a year after they met, he decided, he wanted to propose. He got a ring, he proposed, she said yes. They didn't have a lot of money, so they just had a city hall wedding, planned to do a bigger celebration later on when they could afford it. She worked as a personal trainer and he was an Uber driver. And it turned out they had opposing schedules. So they really only saw each other. They weren't seeing each other a lot for a long period of time, because she'd come home from work, he'd go to work. He'd come home, she'd go, which is it happens a lot in a lot of relationships. So at first, they shared expenses. He would pay half the rent, half the utilities, etc. As time went on, he started paying for most of the rent, most of the utilities, most of the phone bills. And he found out after they got married why. It turned out she had a lot of financial trouble she hid from him. I've actually had clients ask me, I only had one, I think it was one, maybe more, maybe two, who asked us to run a background check before they got married. They're like, not that I don't trust this person, but you never know who the person is. If he had, if it seems like there's a financial issue, it's not a bad idea to do. But obviously, I could see people having issues with that, with trust problems. So when she told him that, he had told her, "Well, look, I've been saving money. I wanted to surprise you on a trip." And he kept trying to say, like, "Let's go on a trip," and like planning trips, but she just wanted the money. She's like, "I need the money for my problems. I need to solve my problems," which would probably be red flag numero 4. It's, spouses, your spouse might have a problem. They might need money. Things happen in life, but to hide it before you get married, to come out after, and then to basically demand him pay off her debt, which I don't even know if he could pay off her debt. Red flag. So now we get to red flag number 5. And when I say he was becoming more and more dependent on her, she was making all the decisions in their life. She wanted to control everything. And he kind of just went along with it for a while. He's a really nice guy, but he was intimidated being in a new country, not knowing anyone. He felt like she knows better because she was born here. But when he realized, she doesn't always know better, and then he tried to stand up for himself, that's when the problems really started. First, she was just irritated. Her irritation turned into aggression, where she would shout and she would scream. She would tell him he's dumb or foolish. She would tell him to keep his thoughts to himself because they were so dumb. And the abuse just got worse and worse. It went from psychological to physical and financial. She tightened the grip of control over him as time went on. So let's talk about this case. Is unique also. Well, not too unique, unfortunately, when it comes to what I'm about to mention. But not all cases have multiple types of abuse. Sometimes there's just physical. I mean, usually there's not just physical. Usually there's at least psychological too. But you don't always have psychological, physical, and financial. Although you have it a lot. Maybe I retract that statement. But in this case, all 3 were very present. So psychologically, she would humiliate him in front of friends and family, insult him in public regularly, told him that he didn't have a right to state an opinion. And then when he'd get upset, and again, these are all red flags, by the way, every single one of these. And this is a big one because people don't realize this is a red flag. So she would like make fun of him. And then when he'd get upset, instead of apologizing or anything, she'd say, "You can't take a joke." Well, let me tell you something. Your spouse is supposed to be your number one supporter. They shouldn't be making fun of you. And if you're getting upset, I mean, you guys can joke all you want, but if your spouse is getting upset, saying you can't take a joke, not the best response. She would swear at him loudly, constant threats of deportation if he didn't comply with her every demand. She would also, while he was driving, be cause like I was starting to think the word. She would be reckless. She would shout at him and text him and call him continuously, and she almost caused him to get into multiple accidents, which we actually described in detail in his affidavit in support of the VAWA claim. She would also engage in physical abuse. She smacked him in public in the head. She'd hit him, shake him, and she would throw household objects at him, such as or at the wall, such as she'd break cell phones, which for an Uber driver you can't really drive without one. So that would be a very big problem. She threw glasses at him. She hit him in the head with a pan. And then you have the financial abuse slash. These aren't really the same category because control kind of goes through all these categories, but I'm calling it financial slash control. She began monitoring his income to make sure he spent all his money on her. In fact, he would send money back to his kids regularly, and she would prohibit him from sending more than a certain amount. And if he tried to question her about the finances, she would flip out at him. And then like the money issues just got worse and worse. He would give her money to like pay the cell phone bill because again, he needed it to do his job and he couldn't have an interruption in service. But instead she would go out and spend it on something else. She knew how badly he needed to keep his cell phone service going. So she manipulated him by making him give her money and then spending on something else. So he basically was paying bills twice. And it wasn't just a cell phone bill. That's just an example. He eventually had to actually get a separate phone so that he didn't have an interruption in his work. She also didn't let him have access to the mailbox. This is another thing I've seen a lot in abusive relationships. She'd hide letters from him that he received and even open his mail without his permission. After the marriage interview, she demanded his car insurance, which he later learned she was going to lease a car behind his back. Because of her financial troubles, she had no credit. She couldn't get it on her own. And this really, all of these things, I mean, I'm scratching the surface here. I'm not going into every little thing. But as you can see, there's some really severe abuse going on here. This caused him to be depressed, to have anxiety, have diminished self-worth. He had some long-term effects, PTSD, panic attacks even. And eventually, during their marriage, she admitted to him that her prior lover was a woman, and she met him shortly after that relationship ended. And she would get drunk a lot, which goes back to my first red flag about when someone drinks too much, or when their life revolves around drinking, or their favorite activities include only drinking activities, because usually there's a lot more going on there. And the drinking got worse. And when she'd get drunk, she would say, well, I confused my desire to help you with with loving you and all of these things. It was just because I was in need. And then she'd apologize when she wasn't drunk, but that obviously is a really hurtful thing to hear. So in 2019, they finally had their marriage interview, and she refused to prepare. She said, "We have a real marriage. There's nothing to prepare for." I'm sure you can guess how the marriage interview went. Not very well. And of course, she blamed him. She said, "It's your fault." And while they were driving home, she started beating him on the shoulder, head, on his arms, and he lost control of the wheel and had to actually stop the vehicle because he would have gotten into an accident if he didn't. So, as I said, she was an alcoholic who became a very different person when she drank. This is when she was at her most aggressive and physical. And this was happening regularly. So why didn't he call the police? Well, he was ashamed. And in his country, if he would have called the police, they would have looked down on him. They would not have helped. Um, and they would have said it's a domestic dispute. You deal with it on yourself, on your own. So that's what he tried to do. And he, because of the shame, and again, this is very common, and it's unfortunate that people feel they have to, live like this and not be able to seek help. He hid it from everyone. He rationalized her behavior um, as these are normal couple spats. These things happen. That she has a stressful job. She is this. She is that. She was. He thought he could change her. Side note: I actually said this to a client today. You cannot ever change anyone. The only person who can change you is you. Don't ever forget that. And the hard part was for him too is that she was there for him when he needed her the most, when he felt abandoned and had no one and nothing. So he wanted to believe that she could change. And again, this is all, I could write a script for how these cases go, and this kind of hits every box there. And so he actually didn't realize that he was a victim of domestic violence until he left the US, returned to Georgia, his home country, and started going to a psychologist. And by the way, after the marriage interview, which when I talk about these cases, I always talk about how there are certain markers in a case where abuse begins or abuse gets worse. Well, in this case, it fits, like I said, it fits the script. After the marriage interview, her abuse increased drastically. It just became regular. Her attempts to humiliate him increased. Then a second marriage interview was scheduled. And she threatened not to go unless he paid her money. Now, spoiler alert, they didn't go to the interview. He left the country. But we'll get to that. Again, this was causing him severe depression. He was having suicidal thoughts. And that's why he left the US. He actually, he didn't have anywhere else to go. He didn't want to be in violation of the law. So he left. So she was at work one day. He packed his bags. He went to a friend's house for 2 nights and then hopped on a plane and left. He left because she was abusing him. Period. And he lived with her that whole time, from when he moved in 2017 until he left in September of 2019. Go over good moral character real quick. He did have an arrest in 2017. He could not afford car insurance, so a friend said, "Hey, put these temporary tags on. They're legal." And he was new to the country, didn't know, got pulled over and arrested, and he was very confused. They told him that these are fake tags, and he showed up at court and they're like, "You're not on the list, your case was dismissed." So he actually did not have to deal with the criminal case, but it is still something that you mentioned, and we did have to provide a no prosecution letter. So what kind of evidence did we have? Well, first of all, you have to show proof of your spouse's immigration status, that they're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. But he did not have that, because sometimes clients who have been in the relationship do, sometimes they don't. He didn't have a copy of it. And the FOIA file will redact all of the other person's information, because it's your file. You're not allowed to get their information. They're supposed to redact it. So we couldn't even get her birth certificate in the FOIA file. But because she had filed for him before, and this is this is VAWA, and there are exceptions to the evidence requirements. In his detailed affidavit, which is the second piece of evidence that we submitted, we explained that he knew she was born in Brooklyn, because they actually got a request for evidence when they filed the marriage petition the first time around. And she saw the birth certificate. They gave it to their old attorney, and the attorney submitted it. And I know what you're thinking out there. You're like, well, if USCIS has it, why do you even have to give it to them? Well, as I said earlier, you can't assume they have it. Plus, with VAWA, completely different office. But when you tell them that, it's because it's a VAWA and because they know you're fleeing abuse, and you might not even know what documents to grab when you flee. As long as you explain it, they will go and actually look and check to make sure. And I've had plenty of cases where I've gotten these approved where the client did not have proof or good proof of the person's immigration status. Of course, we submitted their marriage certificate. The spouse, his wife was previously married. We actually didn't have the divorce. Again, something we wouldn't show up in the FOIA. It should have been submitted. But we did for some reason have a certificate of dissolution. My guess is they thought that was the divorce the first time around. And then you can put in the index number online and it actually shows that the divorce was granted. USCIS will not accept that on a normal basis for a normal marriage-based, family-based petition. For a VAWA, like I said, there are exceptions. He also had a certificate of no impediment to marriage. Why did he need that? He probably didn't. But because he had this domestic partner, I'm not sure how they filled out the visa applications for the visitor visa. It wasn't a bad idea to have. I have a client right now, or potential client, who they have a big problem because they had some type of thing similar to domestic partnership in Brazil. It's called a stable union. And they did not get a divorce, but they didn't have the certificate of no impediment to marriage, but they didn't know they needed a divorce. And it all came to a head. The wife is a US citizen, the husband is not. And it all came to a head at the marriage interview because they're trying now. USCIS is saying that their marriage is void because the husband is still married. So hopefully I'll get to talk about that case one day because that's an interesting issue. I've had plenty of clients come to me thinking they were married, only for us to tell them the bad news. Your divorce isn't final, or you guys got to get remarried for whatever reason. So what marriage evidence did we have? It wasn't a crazy amount, but it was a decent amount for VAWA. They did have a joint Con Ed bill, joint tax return, joint bank account. I didn't go back and look at how much activity. I briefly saw there wasn't a huge, there weren't months and months and months of statements. He had his New York driver's license with the shared address, car insurance with the shared address, affidavits from 4 friends who attested to the bona fides of their marriage, and photos from their wedding and other photos of them with family and friends. And don't forget his detailed affidavit, where I think it was 9 pages long, where he really detailed the entire relationship and explained everything that happened, and also explained, why he didn't have a lease. Well, he didn't have a lease because he wasn't on the utility bills on the not on the Con Ed. He did have a joint Con Ed. It was the cell phone plan. He was on her family plan, but she said she couldn't put his name on it because it was the friend on there, and the lease she just said she couldn't put him on, and he didn't question it. Evidence of abuse. Again, the detailed affidavit. We also had the letter from his psychologist in Georgia, and then we had proof of his return flight that he left the US right when he said I had enough of the abuse in September of 2019, and then I left. And then finally, the good moral character evidence. We had affidavits from friends attesting to his good moral character, his own statement, the declined prosecution letter from that arrest, New York State background check. So there was a lot of good evidence in here. But not an overabundance, nothing crazy. But for a VAWA case, sometimes you have almost nothing. So it was a pretty decent amount. And not only was the VAWA approved for him, but it was approved for his 2 minor children that we put on there. And that is one of the nice things about VAWA. Even if your children are out of the country and not with you, and you're in the country, or you're out of the country with them, you can put them on there and they get approved automatically if you do. So what are his next steps? So his case, I'm happy to say, was already transferred to the National Visa Center. Sometimes people call me asking me, it's been 2 months, what's going on? but his case was transferred pretty quickly. So we're starting the MVC process, which includes filing. Well, he doesn't need an affidavit of support. We file an exemption. We file some civil documents. We do the immigrant visa application, pay some filing fees, and then once the National Visa Center has everything, they're going to transfer his case to the embassy in Georgia, where his interview will be scheduled. Him and his children will then go to the interview. All goes well. They get the immigrant visa in their passport, then will enter the US as permanent residents. Within a few weeks of entry, they will receive the green card in the mail. Very important that he's going to have to be prepared for at the interview, the immigrant visa interview abroad, is they're going to ask him about, because he did overstay his visa. I believe it was less than a year, but it was nonetheless an overstay. Once you file for the adjustment of status application, as long as it's a good faith filing, it kind of stops your clock. So if you overstayed for 2 months and then marriage petition and green card applications filed for you, it stops the clock and then it starts again upon the denial. So you don't accrue unlawful presence the whole time it's pending. But if you have a previous overstay, the problem that I was talking about earlier is when you overstay your authorized period of stay, you're going to have a bar from returning to the U.S. And I actually just had a client who was married to a U.S. citizen. I believe he gave up his green card or didn't get got it conditional, and he ended up leaving the country. It's been 10 years. So he has no more bar because he did overstay for a year, but they did deny his visa at the interview for non-immigrant intent. That is common, whether or not you had a previous overstay, to be honest. But when you do, even if there's no bar for you to return, even if you overstay only 2 months, you don't have a 3-year bar, but you have to expect they're going to be questioning you a lot about if you're applying for a visitor visa, especially about your intent to remain in the U.S. permanently, and you have to really show ties to your country. This client will not have to do that because of the immigrant visa. What he will have to do is show that he is eligible for the exemption, or the exception, they call it the exception, because you trigger the bar to reentry, this 3-year bar and 10-year bar, once you exit the U.S. If you don't leave the U.S., you don't have a bar. You never trigger a bar. That's why it's ideal that when people enter with visas, when they overstay, that if they can get a green card in the U.S., we get them the green card in the U.S. But once you leave, you trigger that bar. So he triggered it as soon as he left. However, if we can show, which I don't think it will be very difficult whatsoever, that the abuse was connected, it doesn't have to be the only reason he left, but it has to be connected in a significant, I don't want to use the word significant, because that's not what the statute says. I don't know the exact word to use, but you have to show that there's a direct connection. I'll say, I think I'm confident with that language. So like I said, we have this long detailed affidavit, and that really explains things happening in their relationship up until September 2019. And then he says, once he realized, I can't take this anymore, I got it, and I can't stay here, I have nowhere else to go, he left. And we did provide the ticket and the plane ticket back home. So we're going to have him prepared for that at the interview. So what is their main takeaways from this case? Number one, male, female, gay, straight, whatever your sexuality is, VAWA is a possibility if you are unfortunately a victim of abuse at the hands of your spouse. Again, parents and children as well, but we're focusing on spouses right now. Second thing, takeaway, look for the red flags in your relationship. Just be aware of them. Not everything I mentioned are necessarily a red flag in every case, but the red flags start to add up. Get yourself out of a situation before it gets bad. He would have been eligible for VAWA very early on in their marriage, based on the way she treated him. So, you should not stay in a relationship for any reason if you are an abuse victim, and there is help out there if you need it. And if you go to our website, you go to our Facebook page, and I'll post it again. Some of the really helpful nonprofits out there that can help you if you're in this type of situation. So look for the red flags. FOIA files can be very helpful if your spouse previously filed for you, or anyone, but especially if you're looking for your marriage evidence. And this is especially true if you had to flee the marital home and really didn't take much of that evidence with you or didn't know to. Also, your affidavit in support of your VAWA application. I tell my clients this every time, is the single most significant piece of evidence that you are going to submit. Even if you have all the evidence in the world, you still got to explain what happened. And nobody with a VAWA has all the evidence in the world because of the situation. Usually this financial control, the control over person's life, that's all part of it. I mean, that's pretty common. So a lot of times people don't have a lot of evidence. Your spouse might try to control you by not putting you on the insurance, by not putting you on the lease, by not joining a bank account with you. And that's okay. But as long as everything is explained, even if you don't have proof of your spouse's citizenship, as long as it's explained and it's reasonable, you should be fine. And you do have to make every effort to get it if you can, but there's no way for him to get her birth certificate. And finally, it is possible to have your VAWA approved if you leave the US and return as a permanent resident. If you didn't overstay your visa and you have no immigration violations, easy peasy. You apply for the VAWA, wait for it to get approved, go through the MVC process. If you have any overstay or immigration violations, really we're talking about overstays, particular, but also unlawful entries. You have to show that your departure from the US is connected to the abuse. If you can show that, you should be eligible for the exception to the 3-year and 10-year bar of inadmissibility that gets triggered when you depart the country after an overstay. So that was a lot to say. I hope I didn't speak too quickly. I'll try to transcribe all of this sometime soon. But I think it's a very good case to look at to see all those things. I'm not going to repeat myself that I just said. I'm sure you don't need me to do that anyway. So that is all today for notable approvals. If you or anyone you know needs help with their VAWA or their immigration case on Facebook, YouTube, our immigration. Our contact info is scrolling across the bottom of your screen. On Instagram, if you go to our bio page, you can find it all there. Don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you're watching. And if you found this video to be helpful, please hit that share button, that save button, leave us a comment. Let me know what you're thinking out there. And if you have any questions, again, you know where to find us. That is all for now. Thank you for watching and have a great day.